Somewhere beneath the surface of the ocean, beyond the reach of memory and the certainty of maps, there lies an idea. It is older than the Roman Empire, older than the library at Alexandria, older even than the foundations of Western philosophy as we know them. It is the idea of a world that once was a civilization of immense power, breathtaking beauty, and fatal arrogance, swallowed whole by the sea in a single, catastrophic night. For more than 2,300 years, this idea has refused to die. It has haunted poets, seduced explorers, inspired scientists, and frustrated historians. It has launched expeditions to the floors of the Atlantic, the shores of the Mediterranean, the coasts of West Africa, and the ice sheets of Antarctica. It has been called the greatest mystery of the ancient world, the most enduring fraud in intellectual history, and the most productive myth humanity has ever told itself. Its name, of course, is Atlantis. And whether or not it ever existed as a real place, it has shaped something undeniably real. The way we search for lost worlds, the way we think about catastrophe, and the way we understand the terrifying possibility that great civilizations can simply vanish from the earth. To understand Atlantis, we must begin not with the ocean, but with a man, a philosopher, an Athenian aristocrat living in a city that had recently survived the most devastating war in Greek memory. His name was Plato, and in or around 360 BCE, he composed two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. That would become among the most debated texts in the Western canon, not because of their metaphysics, though they contain that, not because of their cosmology, though they offer that too, but because embedded within these philosophical works, Plato told a story. A story about a magnificent island civilization, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, situated beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the open Atlantic. This civilization, Atlantis, was founded by the god Poseidon and ruled by 10 kings descended from his bloodline. It possessed concentric rings of water and land, magnificent temples adorned with gold and silver and orichalcum, a mysterious metal now lost to history, and a military force of staggering scale. For generations, Atlantis prospered. Its people were virtuous, its laws were just, but over time, as the divine blood thinned and human nature took hold, the Atlanteans grew corrupt. They became greedy, aggressive, imperialistic. They launched a war of conquest against the Mediterranean world. And it was Athens, a smaller, nobler, more disciplined society, that stood against them and prevailed. Then the gods passed judgment. In a single day and night of terrible earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank beneath the waves and was gone forever. Now, the first thing we must reckon with is context. Plato did not write adventure stories. He was not Homer. He was not composing an epic for entertainment around a fire. He was a philosopher engaged in the most serious intellectual project of his age, the question of how societies should be organized, what justice truly means, and why even the greatest states are vulnerable to decay. The Timaeus and Critias are part of a sequence of dialogues that includes the Republic, Plato's most famous work on the ideal state. In the Timaeus, the story of Atlantis is told by Critias the Younger, who claims it was passed down through his family from the Athenian statesman Solon, who allegedly heard it from Egyptian priests at the Temple of Neith in Sais. The chain of transmission is long. Solon to Dropides, to the elder Critias, to the younger Critias, and finally to Plato's readers. And this matters, because even in antiquity, scholars questioned whether this genealogy of knowledge was genuine or a literary device. Plato's own student, Aristotle, appears to have treated the story with skepticism. A later commentator paraphrased Aristotle as saying that the man who dreamed Atlantis up also caused it to disappear, a rather pointed suggestion that the whole account was invented for philosophical purposes. And indeed, When we read the text carefully, the philosophical architecture becomes difficult to ignore. Atlantis is not merely a lost island, it is a moral lesson rendered in geography. The Atlanteans begin in virtue and descend into hubris. They possess extraordinary material wealth but lose their spiritual integrity. They wage unjust war and are destroyed, not by a rival army, but by the earth itself, as though the natural order cannot tolerate such moral corruption. The parallels to Athens' own experience in the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that ended just decades before Plato wrote. A war that saw Athens overreach, grow tyrannical toward its allies, and ultimately fall, are difficult to dismiss as coincidental. Plato, who watched his city tear itself apart through imperial ambition and democratic dysfunction, had every reason to construct a parable about the consequences of unchecked power. Atlantis, in this reading, is not a map to buried treasure. It is a mirror held up to civilization itself. But here is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Because even if Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical allegory, the question remains: did he build that allegory on a foundation of real events? Myths, after all, do not emerge from nothing. They are shaped by the world their tellers inhabit. And the ancient Mediterranean was a world that had witnessed and partially remembered genuine civilizational catastrophes of an almost unimaginable scale. This question, the question of what, if anything, lies behind the myth, has driven one of the longest and most colorful intellectual pursuits in history. In the centuries after Plato, opinions divided sharply. Some ancient writers, like Crantor, reportedly took the account at face value and even claimed that Egyptian records confirmed it. Others, like the Neoplatonist Proclus, treated it as a blend of allegory and history. Still others dismissed it entirely. During the Middle Ages, Atlantis largely receded from European consciousness, overshadowed by Christian cosmology and the theological preoccupations of the age. The dialogue text survived in fragments and translations, but the lost continent was not a major subject of inquiry. Then came the age of exploration, and everything changed. As European navigators pushed into the Atlantic and encountered the Americas, a startling thought took hold. What if the New World was Atlantis? What if the indigenous civilizations of Mesoamerica and South America were the descendants of Plato's sunken empire? The Spanish chronicler Francisco López de Gomara suggested as much in the 16th century. The idea was intellectually convenient. It offered a classical framework for understanding the bewildering existence of advanced civilizations that European scholars had not previously known about. It was also, of course, deeply wrong, both factually and ethically, as it erased the independent origins of indigenous cultures and forced them into a European mythological template. But the damage was done. Atlantis had been transformed from a philosophical thought experiment into a geographical hypothesis, and the search for its physical location had begun in earnest. By the 19th century, that search reached a kind of fever pitch. In 1882, Ignatius Donnelly, a former U.S. congressman from Minnesota, published Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, a book that became an international sensation. Donnelly argued that Atlantis had been a real island in the mid-Atlantic, that it was the birthplace of all civilization, and that its destruction explained the global prevalence of flood myths. His evidence was a sprawling patchwork of linguistic coincidences, mythological parallels, and geological speculation. By modern scholarly standards, the methodology was deeply flawed. Correlation was treated as causation, and enormous conclusions were drawn from fragmentary and often misinterpreted data. But Donnelly's book was enormously influential. It cemented Atlantis in the popular imagination as a real, findable place and launched a tradition of Atlantis hunting that persists to this day. It also, unfortunately, opened the door to a long line of increasingly speculative and sometimes pseudoscientific claims. From Edgar Case's psychic readings placing Atlantis near the Bahamas to 20th century proposals involving Antarctica, the Sahara Desert, the coast of Spain, and even the South China Sea. And yet, amid all this speculation, a genuinely compelling scientific question endures. Because there is one event in the ancient world that bears a haunting resemblance to the destruction Plato described. An event that really happened, that really destroyed a civilization, and that really was remembered, however imperfectly, by the cultures that came after. Around 1600 BCE, the precise date is still debated, with estimates ranging across several decades. The volcanic island of Thera in the southern Aegean Sea erupted in one of the most violent geological events of the last 10,000 years. The eruption was catastrophic. It blew the center of the island apart, sending a column of ash and pumice perhaps 35 kilometers into the atmosphere. It generated tsunamis that struck the coastlines of Crete, roughly 100 kilometers to the south, with devastating force. And it effectively ended the settlement on Thera itself, burying the prosperous town now known as Akrotiri, a site remarkably preserved beneath volcanic debris, sometimes called the Pompeii of the Aegean, under meters of ash. The civilization that Thera belonged to was the Minoan, centered on the island of Crete. The Minoans were, by the standards of the Bronze Age, astonishingly advanced. They built vast palace complexes, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, with sophisticated plumbing, vibrant frescoes, and a system of writing we call Linear A, which remains undeciphered. They commanded a powerful maritime trade network stretching from Egypt to the Levant to mainland Greece. And then, in the span of a few generations following the Thera eruption, their civilization entered a steep and irreversible decline. The precise mechanisms are still debated. The tsunami damage, the agricultural devastation from ashfall, the possible disruption of trade networks, and eventually the arrival of Mycenaean Greek power all played roles. But the outcome is not in dispute. The Minoan civilization, one of the most brilliant in the ancient Mediterranean, effectively vanished. Its palaces fell into ruin. Its writing was lost. Its people were absorbed into the Mycenaean world and, later, into the broader Greek civilization that succeeded it. The parallels to Plato's account are striking, and they were first systematically explored by the Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos in the 1930s and further developed by the seismologist Angelos Gallinopoulos in the 1960s. Both argued that the destruction of the Minoan world, a powerful island civilization destroyed by a natural cataclysm, could be the historical kernel behind the Atlantis story. Gallinopoulos even suggested that Plato's numbers had been inflated by a factor of 10, perhaps through a translation error from Egyptian to Greek, and that if you corrected this, the dimensions and dates of Atlantis aligned more closely with the Minoan world. The theory is elegant and has earned serious scholarly attention. But it also has significant problems. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic, not in the Aegean. He described it as larger than continents, not a cluster of islands. And his narrative is set 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place Atlantis in the 10th millennium BCE. Thousands of years before the Minoan civilization existed. These discrepancies can be explained away, but only with considerable interpretive flexibility. And that is the enduring difficulty with all Atlantis theories. They require us to decide in advance how literally we take Plato's text, and there is no consensus on this.
Suggests a different location. The artifact challenges the timeline.
Multiple truths could coexist.
Other proposed locations face similar challenges. The hypothesis that Atlantis corresponds to the Richat Structure in Mauritania, a striking geological formation in the Western Sahara. has gained attention in recent years, particularly in popular media. Its concentric ring pattern is visually arresting and superficially reminiscent of Plato's description. But there is no archaeological evidence of an advanced civilization at the site, and the geological formation is natural, formed through erosion over millions of years, not by human engineering. The proposal that Atlantis lies beneath the marshes of Doñana in southern Spain, advanced by researchers examining satellite imagery, has also generated interest but remains unconfirmed by excavation. Each of these theories reveals something important. Not necessarily about Atlantis itself, but about the human desire to find it. We are drawn to the idea that somewhere, beneath the sand or the sea, a great truth is waiting to be uncovered. And in a strange and beautiful irony, that desire has actually led to real discoveries. Not of Atlantis, but of genuine lost worlds that are in their own way equally astonishing. Consider Thonis-Heracleion. For centuries, this ancient Egyptian port city was known only from scattered references in classical texts. Herodotus mentioned it, so did other ancient writers. But no one knew where it was, and some scholars doubted it had existed at all. Then, in the year 2000, the French underwater archaeologist Franck Goddio and his team discovered it. Submerged beneath the waters of Abu Qir Bay, near Alexandria, under several meters of sediment. The city had sunk, gradually, over centuries, as the ground beneath it liquefied due to earthquakes and rising sea levels. What Goddio found was extraordinary. Colossal statues, temple remains, hundreds of anchors, gold coins, intact inscriptions, and the physical infrastructure of a city that had once been one of the most important ports in the ancient Mediterranean. It was not Atlantis, but it was a real city, really lost, really found beneath the sea. Or consider Pavlopetri, off the southern coast of the Peloponnese in Greece. Discovered in 1967, it is one of the oldest submerged cities in the world, dating back approximately 5,000 years to the early Bronze Age. Its streets, buildings, and tombs lie in shallow water, remarkably intact, a ghost city preserved by the Mediterranean. Pavlopetri was not destroyed by a cataclysm. It was gradually inundated as sea levels rose over millennia. But its existence demonstrates something that the Atlantis legend, however mythologized, gestures toward: that the sea has claimed human settlements repeatedly throughout history, and that the ancient world was far more vulnerable to environmental change than we sometimes remember. The discipline of underwater archaeology, which has matured enormously since the mid-20th century, has revealed dozens of such sites around the world. Submerged Neolithic villages off the coast of Israel, drowned Roman ports along the Italian and North African coastlines, inundated structures in the Gulf of Khambat off western India, the ancient harbor of Dwarka, also in India, linked to mythological traditions in Hindu scripture. Each of these discoveries adds to a growing understanding that human civilization and the sea have been locked in a long, slow, and often devastating negotiation, and that the maps we draw today represent only the most recent chapter in that relationship. The coastlines of the ancient world were different from our own. Lands that once supported thriving communities are now underwater, and the memories of those losses, distorted by time, filtered through oral tradition, reshaped by the needs of each generation, survive in the myths and legends that cultures have carried forward across millennia. This is perhaps the most important lesson that the legend of Atlantis offers. Not that there is a specific sunken island waiting to be found, but that myth and memory are not opposites. They are deeply intertwined. When ancient peoples told stories about great floods and sunken lands, they were not simply inventing fantasies. In many cases, they were processing real experiences. The flooding of coastal settlements as ice sheets melted at the end of the last ice age, the destruction of cities by tsunamis, the slow encroachment of the sea on once fertile land. These experiences were traumatic, disorienting, and difficult to explain within the frameworks available to pre-scientific societies. Myth provided a way to encode them, to give them meaning, to pass them on. The story of Atlantis, whatever its specific origins, belongs to this vast human tradition of making sense of loss through narrative. But we must be careful. The line between taking myth seriously as cultural memory and taking it literally as historical fact is a line that matters. Archaeology is a discipline built on evidence, on stratigraphy, on material culture, on radiocarbon dates and chemical analysis, and the painstaking reconstruction of the past from physical remains. It proceeds slowly, carefully, and with a deep awareness of its own limitations. Myth, by contrast, is fluid. It changes with each telling. It serves the needs of the present as much as it preserves the past. When we treat myth as a treasure map, when we assume that every detail in Plato's account must correspond to a specific real-world feature, we risk distorting both the myth and the archaeology. We flatten Plato's philosophical complexity into a geographical puzzle, and we bend the archaeological evidence to fit a predetermined conclusion. The most responsible approach, and the most intellectually rewarding one, is to hold both in mind simultaneously, to respect the myth as myth, to pursue the archaeology as archaeology, and to remain open to the possibility that they illuminate each other without collapsing into each other. This is, ultimately, the story of how we search for the past. It is a story of ambition and humility, of imagination and discipline, of the desire to know, and the willingness to accept uncertainty. The legend of Atlantis has endured, not because we have found it, but because the search itself fulfills a profound human need. We are a species that builds, and we are a species that remembers. We raise cities from stone and timber and steel, and we know, somewhere in the deep architecture of our consciousness, that those cities are not permanent. Earthquakes shatter them. Floods reclaim them. Wars reduce them to ash. Time, that most patient of all destroyers, erodes even the memory of their names. And so we tell stories about the ones that fell. We imagine them grander than they were, more beautiful, more powerful, because the magnitude of the loss must match the magnitude of what was lost. We place them beyond the horizon, beneath the waves, in the spaces where certainty gives way to wonder. Atlantis endures because it speaks to something that is not ancient at all. It speaks to us now, in an age when we are more aware than ever of our own civilization's fragility. We know that sea levels are rising. We know that coastlines are changing. We know that the climate systems upon which our cities depend are shifting in ways that even our most sophisticated models struggle to predict. When we look at Atlantis, we are not only looking backward. We are, whether we admit it or not, looking at a possible reflection of our own future. A future in which the things we built, the systems we trusted, the certainties we took for granted, might one day be spoken of in the past tense by people who can barely imagine what we were. Plato understood this. That is why his story has outlived his physics, his cosmology, and even much of his metaphysics. He understood that the most powerful warning a philosopher can deliver is not an argument, but an image. The image of a great civilization, brilliant and proud, sinking silently beneath dark water, leaving behind nothing but a story and a question. The story is Atlantis. The question is whether we are wise enough to learn from what we have lost. And perhaps the deepest truth of all is this: we do not search for Atlantis because we believe we will find it. We search for it because the searching itself is how we remember. How we insist, against the silence of the deep, that what once was still matters, that the past is not truly gone so long as someone is still looking for it, and that the greatest civilizations are not those that endure forever, but those that leave behind something worth finding.